Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar, which covers website best practice. I hope that everybody is now sort of back on an even keel following the Christmas break and that you're all ready for some interesting information about websites. If you attended our last webinar just before Christmas on maximising effectiveness of your digital communications, you'll know that we did a little teaser of a project that we were working on at the moment around developing an evaluation tool for websites and developing a best practice guide. Our tracker reveals year on year that people are still using council websites as a prime source of information for details on their waste and recycling collection schemes. So we have been working with Resource Futures to develop a tool that will allow you to maximise the effectiveness of your website. So today I'm joined by Sarah Hargreaves, Bethan Jones and Sally Schofield from Resource Futures, who are going to give you a little bit of an insight into the project, show you how the tool works and show you some really practical tips that you can use that are in the best practice guide. And we've also got Kat Turner joining us from Gloucestershire County Council, who's piloted the tool for us to give us her experience of how it's worked in practice. So before I hand over, I'll just run through the usual housekeeping. So for anybody that doesn't know who RAP are, if you just thank you. We are a not-for-profit organisation. We work with businesses, citizens, and the government to create a world where resources are used more sustainably. We do that by reinventing how we design, produce and sell products, rethinking how we use and consume them, and redefining what's possible through reuse and recycling. As always, if we can go on to the next slide, please, Sarah. As always, the webinar today is being recorded. It will be available on our website shortly after today's session. So anybody that hasn't been able to catch us today will be able to go back and get it on catch up. Please do use the chat function to ask any questions. There will be a questions and answers session at the end of the session, but please, as they crop up, just pop them in there and we'll go through them all at the end. Anything that we don't get a chance to respond to, we will make a note of and get back to people by email. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Bethan and she will take you through the project.
Thanks, Debbie. Yeah, and good morning, everyone. I'm Bethan Jones. I'm a director at Resource Futures. So just to give you an overview of what we cover this morning, we're going to give you a bit of context in terms of the research that we undertook for this project and some of the key insights that came out of that initially. We'll introduce you to the best practice guide and talk you through what's in that and all the different sections. And then talk you through the evaluation tools so you can really see how they fit together. We'll give you an idea of some of the pilot results and talking to Kat, as Debbie mentioned, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions as well. So moving on. We're going to kick off with a quick poll question though. So I think you will see a poll come up on the screen and it's just to find out how satisfied you are with the content and structure of your waste and recycling website pages. So we'll give you a moment to answer that. I think whoever's controlling this might be able to see when we've got plenty of responses. And please do ping up the results when you think we've got lots of. There we go. Okay, so a few people very happy. Quite a lot of you actually happy with that content. That's great. But also on balance, you know, lots of people that are unhappy, but great to see nobody's very unhappy. But I think we did find that mix when we were talking to local authorities in our research as well. And, you know, hopefully there's something in this guide for everybody. You know, whether you feel that you're actually doing really well, there should be a few bits in there as well to help you improve. But if you feel like you've got a long way to go, hopefully, again, it will help you prioritise. So Sarah, we're going to move on to talking through a little bit about the research and what we found. So first of all, we looked at a sample of local authority websites, about 30. We did a whole mix, so we looked at different recycling rates, we looked at different local authority types, unitary, different collection systems, and different locations, because we wanted to get a real feel for how different local authorities were operating and how that impacted their websites. And we did a lot of desk research to really build our understanding around that. So we looked at things like different terminology that they were using on the websites. We looked at the different approaches to navigation and the ways that the different local authorities were structuring that data on websites. We had a good look at common tools, so things like your A to Z on different materials, the Recycle Now locator tool, different search functions. We looked at things like breadcrumbs, where you can have the little navigation to help you move back and forth. Things like translation support, which are more important for some local authorities than others, and variety of methods being used. And we looked at how normative messaging is being used on those websites as well. So lots of different common tools we looked at. We had a good look at content mix. Lots of them are very text heavy, but there are some which are much more visual. So looked at how visuals and graphics were being used. And importantly, we looked at the user journeys as well. And how many clicks or how long it took people to actually get to key transactional information, like what's my collection day. So following the desk-based research, we interviewed a selection of local authorities. We also spoke to some of the platforms behind many local authority websites. And this was really to get a full understanding of who's responsible for content and for the site in general. And that tends to be multiple teams, whether it's waste and recycling officers, comms team, the web team. There's a lot of different people involved. We looked at how the content hierarchy is defined and talked to them about, how they prioritize that information. And then we talked to local authorities about what they felt was most critical, what they're trying to achieve with that content on the website. Importantly, we also dug into things like the challenges and restrictions they faced. And alongside the platforms, really thinking about whether they were real challenges, real restrictions, or whether there are ways to kind of work around some of those as well. And we've tried to incorporate all of that. And then the final bit was really about processes and how those processes are built in for local authorities in terms of updating information. So all of this information from the research was pulled in to develop the tool and also to develop the guide. And there were kind of 5 key points I wanted to highlight from that. So one is that waste teams don't always have full control or full ownership of their own web content. So that came across kind of loud and clear, and I think some frustrations there. The balance of educational content and transactional content is not always agreed between teams either. So again, sometimes there's a kind of a trade-off and a balance needed, trying to decide what's the most important there. The kind of review process is, and updates are often not prioritized. So again, just trying to make sure that they are built into the process so that things are updated. Quite often it lands around service change time or a campaign, but having a process to update it regularly is important. And there are many different approaches to the navigation structures. There wasn't really any consistency. And then importantly, waste teams said they often don't have sight of the web analytics data. So that's something that, again, hopefully we address in the guide. So what's in the guide? Well, the research really informed what we put in there. And we designed the guide with waste and recycling officers in mind, but also knowing that it's going to be useful as well for the comms team, for your web team, but really primarily it's for waste and recycling officers. One thing we would want to sort of emphasize is, if you haven't done so already, do check your local authority accessibility policy and formatting guidelines, things like that, and looking at platform restrictions or structure. Because if you go into the guide really understanding what flexibility there is or isn't, it will help you to really have a clear path forward and be able to plan things more effectively. I think the other thing about the tool is that, and the guide, is it helps build a dialogue with the other teams. So again, that's why we say, you know, do share it with the other teams as well. It's all about you being able to start that dialogue, and we'll come on to more of that with Sarah a bit later on. So what's covered in the guide? Well, it's advice and content around content, first of all. So we have taken, we're thinking from the perspective of the residents, so assume they know nothing. And we look at the role of educational and transactional content, as I said, how's that balance best interpreted on your website. We look at making the most of text-heavy content, if there are kind of restrictions on visuals, and what you can do to kind of make things stand out. And we look at calls to action, so importantly, trying to guide people to actually take an action. We look at navigation, so the content prioritization, top tips for the menu design, so helping people to really be able to find what they need easily, and looking at ways to maximize engagement, so avoiding things like dead ends and making sure they've always got somewhere to go for that further information. There's a section on accessibility as well, and that's really understanding all the ways that different people might access the site and might need to interpret that information. So again, I think that's a really useful section, just to make sure that you are ticking those boxes and that it is available for everybody. And then, as I mentioned, analytics is something that the waste and recycling teams often don't have direct access to. So we've got a section on analytics, and looking at powerful ways. It is a powerful way to understand how content is working. And so I think understanding a bit more about which top metrics to look at and why can really help you to kind of build a case to access that information, and also then use it to prioritize what you want to do with your content. So the guide kind of finishes off with some best practice examples, and really shouting out where we think there are some local authorities doing some of these things really, really well. There's also a list of different wrap assets, which again, really helpful in building your wider comms as well. And then there's a glossary of terms as well at the end of the guide, so making sure we're all understanding those terms and all on the same page. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah to pick up on the business case element.
Hi everybody, yes, I'm Sarah Hargreaves, I'm the Behaviour Change Lead at Resource Futures. So one of the things that we did find through our research was that quite often local authority waste and recycling teams don't have full access to the websites to make the changes that they want. So there can be a conflict between teams on how that content is prioritized, structured, even the terminology that's used. And the evaluation tool and the best practice guide are there to help you build these conversations and really move this conversation forward. So we start the best practice guide with some potential conversations that you can use to start building that business case. We know, having worked in local authorities myself and all of you guys as waste and recycling officers, that the data that we're trying to get across around waste and recycling is often complex. It has a number of nuances, and those finer details and impacts may not be understood by wider external teams. So it's our role to try and help them understand why we want to put information across the way that we do, why certain pieces of information are high priority, even if they're not deemed as high priority by somebody else. So we have a few conversation starters in the tool that will hopefully help you along that journey. For example, we found in our research some of the local authorities were struggling to include information about reuse and reduce on their websites because it wasn't deemed transactional content, and the primary role of a council website is to give people the data that they specifically need to undertake a task. Now, obviously, there's a statutory obligation to follow the waste hierarchy, which immediately gives you a reason to talk about prioritization of those other educational topics around the waste consumption, the reduce, the reuse. And just focusing on recycling and waste It's further down the waste hierarchy, so that there does need to be a conversation about changing that dynamic. Also, the more we can get people engaging with our collections, the more cost savings there are to the council. We're introducing cost efficiencies, we're reducing contamination, we're increasing the value of the recyclables being collected. So there's a really good cost argument in there as well. So we really hope that these conversations, topics will help you continue those discussions and better, I don't want to say argue, but better negotiate the case for changing potentially what data is going up there, what structure you're using, maybe enabling to introduce more normative style messaging that really helps get those conversations across. So it's time to introduce you now to the evaluation tool. The best practice guide really does go hand in hand with the evaluation tool. What we've designed it so that the tool will tell you which particular sections you could potentially improve on, and it will highlight different parts of the best practice guide for you to go and read into. So they're very complementary assets. They do really work hand in hand. So this is a screenshot of the top section of the tool. There is a little section above as well that will allow you to put in your name, so who's doing the evaluation, what date are you doing it. It just lets you record those touch points so that you can come back to this, save a copy, and review what decisions you made. And as Bethan mentioned before with the best practice guide, the tool is designed with waste and recycling officers primarily in mind, but it will be really interesting for you to encourage other teams who are engaged with your website to also run the tool. You may find there are situations where actually you don't have the full picture and the web, IT, or the comms team actually answers in a different way because they understand a nuance that you weren't aware of. You may also find that there are situations where your opinions differ. So it allows you to have a really good conversation around why that is, how can you navigate through this. So it should hopefully provide you with a really interesting point of dialogue. So you can see on the left, we have a number of evaluation questions. These are split into, I think it's 7 sections we have. You can see here user journeys and content. There's a number of questions within each, and each of these questions from a response point of view is weighted based on how important we think it is in relation to the other questions within that piece. Each question then has 4 options for you to make a response against. And these are scored 0, 1, 2, and 3. It's not about good or bad. It's just about stating where you're at within this particular question. And you may well find, as we did during the pilot phase, that for some local authorities, the question and the categories doesn't exactly fit the situation that they have in place within their local authority. That doesn't matter. We really encourage you to think about the tool, kind of step back and interpret the categories and the question in order to best fit the scenario that you're faced with. It's important that you record what decisions you make when you're responding to the questions to allow somebody else who picks it up next time to understand, oh, I see, that's why they made it a 2. They could have actually marked that as 0 as well, but they've picked the 2 and this is why they've done it. So don't look at it as a black and white resource. It's really there for you to adapt and interpret as you feel best. So this section at the end, you've got the green column where you're putting in your scores. And for each question within each section, you will get a little red, amber, green traffic light coming up that tells you where we think you're at on that journey. And there's also the notes section, and I really encourage you to use that. I think it's really important to record how you made a particular decision and what the decision process was within that. So once you've completed all of the questions through all the different 7 sections, you will then come to a results dashboard. Now here we'll be summarizing what your score is across each of those 7 sections. And you'll see that those 7 sections very nicely match what is in the best practice guide. So we're looking at those user journeys. How long does it take people to get from A to B on really critical topics? what content do you have in there and what is your approach to content, the navigation, the content management system and your processes that are in place. There's questions in there around accessibility and also on signposting, getting people to really understand how they can move around your site and find the information. And then a section on the web analytics as well. The scoring section, just to run it through with you. So you will get your score. So for example, here we've got a score of 53 being achieved out of a total score available of 72. So you can see where you're sitting within the total number of points that are available. And then you'll have, there's a color-coded, conditional formatted traffic light for the percentage rating. Now, these results are your results only. We're not suggesting that you share the results with RAP, that you compare yourself to other people. This is purely for your internal use. And the color coding that you will see on the percentage rating section will be completely unique to your local authority. So this is not comparable to anybody else. If your lowest score across all the sections is 33%, then red will appear in the 33%. And that's advice that potentially signposting in this case is the area where the most benefit could be placed if you were to do some developments. It may be that the lowest score when you run it is 62%, and so the red score would appear there. So these are not banded colors, these are based on the proportion of results that are coming out and where we think you're going to find most value in making adjustments going forward. There's also a recommendation section here. This is really just signposting you to the relevant parts of the best practice guide so that you can quickly identify where you're most likely going to find some useful information to boost your scores in those areas. Sometimes that may be just one section, but quite often there are 2 or 3 different sections that will touch on areas that will help you improve. So some top tips. Just to reiterate again, the scores are completely confidential. They're there to help you prioritize. They're not judgmental in any way. It's just for you to run the evaluation tool, see what results come out, and use that to help prioritize where you may change next. It's really up to you how you interpret the categories. You control those decisions. And so you should use your best judgment and record your scoring decisions and queries in the notes section so that you remember when you look back at it next time and other people picking it up will understand what approach you took to it. We think it's really important that you share the results with colleagues, either within your own team and also with outside teams so that you can really start a dialogue around what needs to change and what developments would be useful. Each time you use the tool, save a version that helps you track the history, and doing regular reviews will really help with decisions and planning going forwards. We hope that using this tool will really help you build a business case for change by seeing where things are working well and where there's potential for improvement. It will help you boost that dialogue with those external teams and also within your own team, just to understand where you're at now and where the best changes could happen next. We suggest here that your review could be every 6 to 12 months. Again, this is up to you. We know some local authorities in our pilot felt they might do it more frequently than that. And so it's really up to you to build that in and schedule that so you can properly move forwards and progress with those changes. So we were very lucky that some of the local authorities that we covered during our stakeholder research were able to pilot the tool for us. And that was a very useful process because there are a number of nuances within different local authority contexts. So it was interesting to see how people responded to it, where we needed to make little tweaks into the questions and those question categories. I can't say it often enough, the categories are never going to match every local authority scenario, so do interpret them as you feel best. But from what we found, pretty much everybody who responded to the pilot found that it didn't take very long at all to complete, about 10 to 15 minutes, and that was consistent across all of them. So it's quite a quick tool to go through. People typically found it very useful, and it made people think about some of the website content in a different way to how they might have been thinking about it previously. We're going to come on to speak to Kat in a minute, but one of Kat had mentioned that the user journey was something they needed to work on. So they're going to continue with that and score themselves every time they make a change. And we had people saying it prompted questions and highlighted things they may not have thought about before. So just by going through the tool itself before even seeing the guide, it was helping people just nudge around what those particular areas are and whether they'd given them the right amount of consideration beforehand. So I'm going to bring in Kat now. I'm in the slightly odd situation that I actually can't see anybody. So Kat, I assume that you are there and ready.
I am indeed.
Fabulous. Thanks, Kat. It's great to have you here. And thanks for being one of the testers on the evaluation tool. So just firstly, can you tell us how you found using it?
Yeah, I thought it was really easy to use. It probably took me less than 10 minutes. I think depending on how well you know your website depends on maybe how long it will take. And because I'm fortunate enough that I'm able to make the changes myself as a waste officer, I know the website inside and out, so it really didn't take long at all.
Brilliant. And for somebody outside of your team, I guess it would probably take them a little longer to go through it, but again, it still wouldn't take particularly long to run through.
Yeah, no, I don't think it would take long at all.
The setup that you have in Gloucestershire is fairly complex. You've got your residents have a number of different sites to navigate in order to find their information. We talked before about how the tool has the questions and the categories and how people shouldn't look at them in a linear format. I would imagine when you ran through it that you found exactly that. You didn't have one site to measure against. You actually had, I think you've got 8 different sites to measure against. So how did you manage the tool in that context?
Yeah, so we've got our county council website. All of the districts have their own website, and we also have our Gloucestershire Recycles website, which is a partnership website that covers obviously anything recycling, waste min, that kind of stuff. And so initially it was quite tricky to figure out some of the answers to some of the questions. So things like click through to what date is my bin collection. That information is not on the county council website or on Recycles. So I kind of had to make the assumption people started at Gloucestershire Recycles. Whether they did or didn't, I'm not quite sure. They might have started on the county council website and then clicked through again, which is even more clicks. So that's why we knew navigation was an issue because we've got so many different websites. But we used the standard of it being on the Gloucestershire Recycles homepage, and then I used that answer for the rest of the questions. We'll do the same going forward. So we've always kind of got a base for us to work from, which might be different for each council based on how many websites they've got and where that information is sat.
Brilliant. That's really interesting because there will be situations when I'm sure your residents are coming at it from different angles. So trying to benchmark, okay, let's start with this route. This is the most useful way to go. We're going to assume they come from the Gloucestershire Recycle site, and then measuring that through. And I guess in a future iteration, you could look at it from a different angle and consider, okay, what if they go to the county council site first, or what if they go through one of the district sites? And best to go through making those notes to understand which particular route you're measuring at the time to see how those things change. That's really interesting because it is quite a complex scenario you've got there. So it's really good to know that you were able to make it work and take that average approach. So what benefits did you find from using the tool? Because I know that it did give some insights to you.
Yeah, so we've had a look at our website in the past. We knew there were a couple of things that needed work on. Sorry, you'll have to excuse the cats. They don't have very good Zoom etiquette. So we knew there were some things that needed some work. And like I said, navigation is definitely one of them. But when you kind of see a number and a percentage against things like that, it kind of makes you think, oh, we're working on the right thing, or oh, we haven't thought about that yet. So one of the things I hadn't thought about at all were dead ends. And that was one thing that came up from using the tool, that I don't even know if we have any dead ends or that it's a problem. I guess we didn't really think about it. I didn't think that the fact that you got onto a page and then there was nothing else to do on the page was an issue. So definitely something we're going to look into, because we just weren't aware of it to start with, and others came up as well, like images. We know we don't have many images on the pages. So just kind of seeing that in number format, telling you this is something we need to work on. It helped kind of prioritize where we should be, what we should be looking at over the coming months.
Fabulous. So do you think you'll use the tool again? Do you think it will be a useful benchmarking tool as you make additional changes?
Definitely. I think maybe every quarter or so, whenever we update anything, I think we'll then redo the tool and kind of see where we're at, see what that we then need to focus on going forward.
Brilliant. Oh, that's really great to hear. Thank you again so much for taking part in that process and helping us understand where things work, and also ironing out some early glitches, which was good to get out of the way before it goes out any wider. So that's the main information around the tool and the guide itself. As we said, they work very much hand in hand. And the guide will introduce you to the tool itself and provide you with a link over to it so that you get them both together. We do really advise that you use them side by side and you do continue to share the information across the teams. It was very interesting with the pilot groups that we worked with a number of different authorities who had different scenarios. So one had a very high performing website, and were able to record themselves against that, score that, and see again the prioritizations, the areas that were suitable to them. With CAT, they had this really complex system with 8 different websites. So understanding how they were best going to adapt the tool to suit that context. It was interesting to see how they were able to navigate that. And another local authority who piloted it had a very complex relationship with external teams and very restricted access to making changes into their content. So it was useful to see how they were scoring themselves, and good to see the different areas where they could potentially work on next. And hopefully the best practice guide will help them with those ongoing conversations to really bring other teams on board. So I feel like we've rattled through all of that ever so quickly, but I think it would be a good time now to open the floor to any questions.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Really useful talk through of the tool and the guide. We have got a couple of questions, but everybody else that's listening, please feel free to use the chat function to ask any other queries that you might have. One of the ones that's come through already is from James asking about clicks from the homepage. So obviously, as part of the tool, we do ask about that user journey and how many clicks it is to sort of certain pages. James querying sort of how relevant is that, and won't people just sort of Google what they want? I guess that's the case, but aren't we sort of wanting to kind of encourage people to take a particular route to information and make sure that that's as logical a process as possible?
Yes.
That's Sarah.
Yeah, we picked 5 key transactions that we felt were critical for people to be able to find, on the basis that people are likely going to come onto that homepage of the council website. When is my collection day? Very common question. How do I get a new container? Where is my local recycling centre? So the plan was to understand how quickly can they get through to those points. And again, if you're finding that those particular questions that you may want to add in a different question into that, again, you can add that into the notes to say, we also scored this one and it came to this many clicks. So again, it's really up to your interpretation. But yeah, we identified a number that we assume people will start from the main council homepage and move into the area from that. But as Kat said, they had to slightly adapt that because they figured people would come in from their Gloucestershire Recycles page and then link through that way.
I was just going to add that, you know, if you've got access to analytics as well, you'll see where people are kind of landing on the site, and you'll see whether they're coming from Google search. So again, it will help you to determine the prioritization. So actually, you might decide that the user journeys aspect is not something you want to kind of really prioritize based on that analytics information. But you might be equally surprised at how many people actually come through from the main homepage.
Smashing, thank you. Sue has asked whether, as part of the sort of piloting of the tool, did we get any other staff within local authorities that are perhaps not so familiar with waste to use the evaluation tool? I guess that wasn't kind of although we want to encourage, like we said at the beginning, sort of comms teams and digital teams to take part in that process in order to kind of gauge different opinions on the effectiveness of the site. I guess working with people that aren't as familiar with waste is more kind of about going back to that user journey process, isn't it? It's kind of making sure that we're following logical steps and sort of thinking as a resident rather than a waste practitioner.
Yes, definitely. And we certainly found on quite a lot of the websites that we reviewed in our desktop research that it did seem that local authorities were assuming quite a large amount of pre-knowledge. So somebody coming new to an area and wanting to understand what are the particular bins and what can I put in them, sometimes it was quite tricky to work out based on the website. So during our stakeholder piece, we did try to talk to web and comms teams as well. They're typically quite hard to get hold of, as I'm sure you are all aware. So we did have some joint conversations, but primarily we were focusing on the waste and recycling teams themselves, and they were the key people who did the piloting process for us. I think it'd be particularly useful to run through the tool in conjunction with the other teams, so sitting together and perhaps discussing the answers as you go through, because it would really start to understand the different angles from which you're coming at these questions and making the responses, and give you the opportunity to continue that dialogue on, but why are you saying that? That's really interesting, and understanding where people are coming from.
Thank you. Zoe has asked, stated that a lot of their web traffic is through Google searches, as James mentioned, but particularly to a HWRC page, only about 3% of people go via the homepage. Will the tool and the guide be useful to design service pages that incorporate sort of reuse messages rather than just the transactional stuff?
Bethan, I can't see if you're going to speak because I still can't see anybody.
I can kick off if you like, Sarah.
Yeah, sure.
I think a lot of the guidance, you know, in the guide is useful for any of those pages. Just really thinking about, the structure and, as we said, the calls to action and the way that you're presenting the information visually, whether that's using images or graphics or, using different texts and things like that. So I think there will be elements in the guide that are going to be useful for any of those pages, whether or not, you feel people are coming through that different journey or whether they're landing on a specific page. And it sounds like this one, particularly important for you, Zoe. Sarah, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, it was very interesting in the research to find that some teams were being restricted on how much educational content they could include in. And there is also a section in the guide around standalone websites and what role they could play. So as Kat said, they have their own site called Gloucestershire Recycles. And a number of local authorities do already have these, and it tends to give greater flexibility to include more educational information, make information a lot more visual and accessible. So that is a route that you could potentially go down. Again, it's not always available. There can be restrictions on whether that is acceptable or not. But we have got in those best practice examples at the end, some websites where they have absolutely no restrictions. So they're kind of an aspirational, where could I potentially go? And even if you can't get as far as some of those websites have done, it at least gives you something to strive towards. And that the mix of the educational and the transactional content is really critical to get the messages across. So hopefully you do find enough in there to help on both sides of that.
Thank you. Zoe's added to that. I think it's possibly something that we covered in the conversation with Kat, but as a disposal authority, obviously the scoring of kind of how easy it is to find your collection day and things like that is maybe not as relevant, but perhaps like Kat suggested, sort of how many clicks it would take to get from the waste disposal authority to the collection information on the district website is a good way to measure that. Would you suggest?
Yes, definitely. And again, it's about interpreting the scores. So if the particular route that you're taking, as you measure it, does give quite a high number of clicks, and the tool is giving you quite a low score, that doesn't mean that your website is poor. You just need to record, this is a score run at the moment, and actually, are we happy with that, or are we not happy with that? If we are going to make changes like Kat and her team are looking to do to increase that user journey, even if they're never going to achieve a very short number of clicks, they'll still be able to see the progress they make as they go through. And it is really useful to decide where you want to measure those clicks from. So if it is from a Google search and then going through, all of those options are perfectly viable and valid. It's just making sure you record it so somebody else picking it up understands what particular process you used.
Thank you. I think one of the things that I found quite useful throughout the project was kind of that through the discussions that you had with the web platforms, that there's possibly a case of a bit of myth busting needs to go on within authorities, kind of around the restrictions and what is feasible. Is that something that you would agree with, Bethan?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I've picked up a little bit on that, but yeah, often there are these, as you say, myths that you can't put images or you can't make certain changes, and actually there is an awful lot of functionality, particularly the kind of main platforms that we spoke to. There often is a lot of functionality that you can build in, but again, it's about having that dialogue and perhaps explaining to your web team or finding routes around it to make sure that you can get another template set up that is going to be more impactful and help you do perhaps more of the educational content you want to do, and make that more powerful. So yeah, definitely myths to bust, and hopefully this should help with that conversation.
Great stuff. There's a couple of other things come through. One from James around the accessibility of the locator tool. So I think that's one for us to take away, James. Have a word with our Recycle Now team and our digital team, and I will come back to you on that one. But then Dominic's asking where the tool will be found. We're actually just making the final tweaks to both the guide and the tool, but they will be available on our website very soon, along with the recording of this webinar. So we'll keep everybody updated that's attended today, and it'll also be announced through our e-zine and on the website. But we will keep people posted, and hopefully it won't be too long. There aren't any more questions coming through, but if people do have anything else to add, please feel free to use the chat while we just run a final poll.
Yeah, we've got a final question, haven't we, Sarah? Yeah, it's really just finding out how keen you are to use the tool, and whether you'll be using it now as soon as it's launched, within the next month, maybe before the end of the financial year, to help you plan for next year's budget, or maybe at the start of the new financial year and help you prioritize. But it'd be good to hear what you have in mind. Great, let's see. Fantastic. So it looks like a lot of you are keen to give it a go. 33% as soon as it's launched. So yeah, you'll get that information through. And then only 12% saying then the beginning of the next financial year. But that's brilliant. It sounds like it will be useful. Sarah, anything else you want to?
No, it's really nice to see a really good mix of responses there. So hopefully it will really add value to the websites. I know quite often when there are discussions around communicating with residents, often social media can take precedence, and people often think that's the most impactful way to get through to people. But we do know, as Debbie said at the start, that a lot of people are relying on this web content as their primary source of information. So making sure that it's as concise and relevant and to the point as possible, and really helps people take their waste and recycling attitudes to the next stage. When we often find that people will talk very strongly about, I'm a very good recycler, I will do all my recycling, and I'm very good at managing that, but actually they don't connect with the other areas of reduce, reuse, and the waste consumption piece. So those conversations are really important to build into website content wherever possible, and we know that that can be tricky with different teams not feeling that that is the priority, and it does need to be more transactional based. But actually having those conversations and really trying to get as much depth into the website content as possible can only add value and hopefully really improve the experience of your residents when they interact with you online.
Thank you very much. That's really useful. Thank you. If you could just bob onto the next slide for me.
Yeah. There we go.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you everybody that's attended today. Hopefully you found that really useful, and we'll make sure that the tools and the webinar are on our site as soon as possible, so that you can start using that and making some improvements to your sites. If you've got any queries about anything that you've heard today, or any other possible support opportunities or areas of advice, then please do feel free to contact the local authority support team. Here we all are. The email protocol for all of us is the same. It's firstname.lastname@rap.org.uk, and you're more than welcome to contact any of us for any advice or support. Like I say, today's webinar will be available online soon, along with all our other recordings, and you'll also be able to register for our next webinar, which is on Tuesday the 1st of March at 2:30, and that will be a follow-on from the previous webinar on our Clear on Plastics and Recycle Now plastic bags and wrapping front of store collections campaign. The webinar will be launching the toolkit and telling you about all the assets that are available to you, so that you can support that campaign through your own channels. So hopefully we'll see you all there. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.